I am Jim Nettles. I am your moderator. I write fiction under James B. McDonald, keep the attorneys happy, a variety of things. I will allow my esteemed panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Jay Requard. I am the author of Thief of Destiny and War Pigs. I am also one of the founders and an acquiring editor at Falstaff Books.
Hi, I'm Stacy Lantagne. I am a member of the legal committee of the Organization of Transformative Works, which runs Archive of Our Own, which is a fanfiction archive. I'm on the legal committee, so you probably knew I'm also a lawyer. I do intellectual property law. I'm also a novelist, though, and I'm also a fan, so I wear all of these hats.
My name is Mandy. I am one half of a writing duo. My husband is closing up in there right now, so he hasn't been here just yet. And I got my start writing fan fiction, and now am writing original fiction.
I'm Dave Ellis. I was a video game designer and writer for about 23 years. Currently working in marketing as a writer. And big fan of a lot of the Star Trek fan films. That's my perspective.
Excellent. I have a good feeder question for that here. Excellent. So, by profession, I am a business and technology consultant. I've worked with IP for a long time. Very happy to have an esteemed attorney on the panel to actually comment on some of the stuff that I come up with. But no, and like I say, this will also be an open conversation. While we'll be talking on the panel, we're also looking for your feedback out there in the audience because we're here speaking for your benefit. So if you do have questions, comments, please feel free, raise your hand, and we'll bring you into the conversation. So looking at this, let's actually start with that definition about intellectual property, and I'm going to be nice and pass that over to you for the moment.
So to define intellectual property? Okay, so intellectual property are all of the things that we say that you own that are intangible, is basically what we're thinking of, right? So you can own your bag that you have bought, but that's tangible and you can touch it and no one else can take it. If someone takes your bag, we call that theft, and it's really easy for us to figure it out because you're like, that's my bag, right? Intellectual property is all the stuff that is intangible, so it's harder to draw the line between what is theft and what is not, right? Because it's harder for you to be like, this is a thing that exists in my head and you stole it, right? Like that's like sci-fi basically. So we have, in law we would say that we have 4 basic types of intellectual property. We have trade secrets, which aren't really relevant to anything we are discussing, but that corporations have a lot of, like the formula from Coca-Cola is a trade secret, so that's a form of intellectual property. We have patents, which are all of the things that are running your iPhones and also your pharmaceuticals and all those kinds of things. Those are all covered by patents. That's science, which I don't understand, so I don't really do. And then we have copyright and trademark, which is the stuff that really tends to be, so trademark covers commercial enterprises like Disney, right? Like owns a ton of trademarks, and your little Apple logo is a trademark, and the Nike swoop is a trademark. Those are all commercial things. And then copyright covers literally everything else, running the gamut from music to books to art to computer programs to architecture. All of that stuff is covered by copyright, and all of that collectively we call intellectual property, even though they're all very different when you actually stop to think about them. But they're all intangible, and they all exist sort of not anywhere else but in our heads, and so that's why they all get kind of lumped together.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm glad not to be the one who has to do that.
I have to do that every year when I teach my class intellectual property, and I have to tell the students what we're learning.
We'll be talking. Anyway, so thanks everybody for joining. I just want to do a quick polling. I know some of you guys were in some of our earlier panels and whatnot. How many of you guys are authors?
Well,
fanfiction.
Short stories count?
Sure,
Everything
absolutely.
counts.
And of course
Everything
they do.
counts.
Just words at the
Everything
page.
counts, yeah.
How many of you guys are developers? I know we're in Raleigh. How many of you, what are you guys looking for in terms of IP to look to protect and understand?
How many people read fan fiction?
I write fan fiction.
Okay, so you should have raised your hand at the writer.
I did.
I'm saying.
All right.
Yeah.
You know, so what we're really talking about here is fair use, and there is something called fair use doctrine. And so fair use doctrine is one of the most gray areas around copyright law you can possibly find. Please tell me if anybody on this panel disagrees.
No.
So I'm going to start with a use case about fair use doctrine just to throw it out there to start the conversation, and that is the Star Trek fan fiction out there is a film that was done. There's Star Trek additional, new voyages and whatnot. We see that. There's a certain degree of acceptance. And I just went blank on the name of the movie that was done.
Axanar.
Thank you. I was going to call it the wrong thing. So, with Star Trek Axanar, there was a very large case that was filed around intellectual property, and intellectual property is a violation. Because, and the main case they said was not because it was characters that were used, not because it was a universe that was used, but because it was a storyline that was already mentioned within canon. So, I'm going to start down this far end here and start talking about Star Trek as a piece of canon, because as we talk about fair use doctrine, as we talk about intellectual property, and as we talk about using existing characters, existing universes to play with in our stories, then I'm going to come back to Sherlock Holmes. But
just to start out, I've got some insider information.
Absolutely, thank you, sir.
When I was working in video games, I met a voice actor named Vic Mignogna, and Vic is the creator of Star Trek Continues. They have a studio down in Georgia where they built the original Enterprise exactly as it was laid out in Paramount in the 1960s. Very cool. Been there a couple of times. At one point, I was going to write a book about all of the fan films, because there are so many Star Trek fan films, and there's Star Trek New Voyages, there's Star Trek Continues, and Starship Farragut, and a whole bunch of others. And I got to talking to Vic because he's the person I know inside this world, and he gave me the inside story to Axanar. The main problem was not so much that the storyline was used, but that Axanar crossed the line with Paramount. Paramount was turning a blind eye to all of these Star Trek shows, and they were really cool. They were most of them set in the original universe, and Paramount was turning a blind eye to it because none of them were making any money off of it. Axanar, they originally made a thing called a 20-minute short called Prelude to Axanar, which was kind of a mockumentary prelude to the movie that they wanted to make, and it was great. It was really cool. They raised a lot of money on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. They set out to raise about $250,000, ended up raising $1.3 million, and proceeded to spend that money on building a studio that they were going to rent out to other productions, so making money off of that studio. Paid the creator of the show a salary. He was taking a salary. The people that were working around him were taking a salary. So when Paramount found out that they were making money off of it, that was when they said, okay, we're going to now lay down the law and say we're going to protect our copyright, because as I understand it, the copyright laws or the fair use laws only come into play if they decide to enforce them.
That's true, yeah.
And Paramount, up to that point, had not
Really,
decided.
all laws are like that,
Yeah.
right? Like, because, like, that's true, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's no, laws are not self-enforcing, right? Yeah, like, somebody has to, right, exactly.
So Paramount was
Right,
cool.
exactly.
Paramount was cool with New Voyages. Paramount was cool with Star Trek Continues. But when Axanar started, they were making money, and they started putting out press releases like, we're going to release this when Star Trek Beyond comes out, and this is going to be a better movie than Paramount is making. Then Paramount's like, okay, we're going to start enforcing now, and that was when they laid down their rules that they recently set.
Thank you for that. So, everybody's now started with the first key here, which frequently comes up in an idea of intellectual property, which is what?
Money.
Don't make money off of it.
So now that we've kind of set the conversation for the evening, which is not about the idea, but it's about who's making a profit from it. Because that's what we're all in here for, is if we're generating it, are we generating content for the purposes of furthering society, furthering ourselves, or is it because we're looking to make a profit?
can it be both, Jim? Can it be both?
Yes.
Well, so now let's throw this idea out
It
there.
can also be neither. Is that
Neither. How many of us are doing it for neither? Or at least how many of us have done it for neither? Anyway. So, let's now go to this idea of public domain. How many of us are aware of the concept of the public domain? I'll refer again to my attorney for the idea of what is really the idea or the true definition of public domain.
Public domain is because it's a complicated question. I'm trying to think of a way of simplifying my answer to this. So public domain is really everything that you can use and not worry about using it, right? Like it's free. But that's not to say that. So yeah, all right, I'm going to say that, yes. So public domain is everything that is free for you to use and you don't have to worry about using it. And sometimes that means, actually all the time, it means ideas. No one is allowed to own an idea. No one can own an idea ever, period. This is important for you, actually. If you have a great idea for something, don't tell anybody else that idea unless you have signed a contract, because you can't own an idea. Nobody can. You can only own the expression of the idea, right? Like that's what, so you own the particular expression of the Star Trek movie, right? And not the actual idea for the Star Trek movie. So all ideas are in the public domain. Of course, it gets tricky. Where does your idea turn into expression? Let's not even talk about that right now, because that's going to be complicated, right? The other, though, thing
But
that...
we're going there.
Yes, we're going to go there, yeah.
Okay.
But I have to finish defining public domain first. I haven't even gotten through my public domain explanation first. Because the other thing that's in the public domain is copyright expires. So copyright expires at different points, and that can be complicated. But everything that the copyright has expired for is considered to be in the public domain. And so there's easy things, which we know, right? Like the Odyssey was written thousands of years ago. We're in public domain, right? Like Shakespeare's plays are all in the public domain. It gets complicated because right now our copyright term in this country is life of the author plus 70 years. And that was expanded 20 years ago.
Thanks to Disney.
Right. So our public domain has actually been frozen. We have not had anything under the public domain in 20 years in this country because we froze the public domain. The first public, yeah.
Can't it be extended to by the family of the creator?
No, it can only be expended by Congress. You get life plus 70.
I like that the family also could own that
The
work.
renewal?
Well, they do own it, but so we used to have renewal of copyright in this country before 1976, and then so you're probably thinking of this is what I mean. It's like complicated, right? So like works created before 1976 have different copyright terms than works created after 1976 because we had a new Copyright Act that came into effect in 1976. Sherlock Holmes, we just had a ruling, is in the public domain, but that was super complicated because the majority of the stories were written before the public domain date cut off, and then 10 were written after, and there was a huge debate about what does that mean, right, for Sherlock Holmes? Is he in the public domain or not?
May I provide another example?
Please go for it.
Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of
Yes.
Mars.
Yeah.
Everyone remembers that Disney movie that came out, what, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, nobody remembers it, but I actually liked it.
Yeah.
I love that.
The thing about public domain and John Carter is that John Carter is actually, I believe the Burroughs family actually has rights to that character.
I think that's right, yeah.
But just because you have rights to the character didn't stop Disney from going in and making a movie. Because they didn't own the idea.
The idea of, right, yeah. And not all, this is actually another thing that's important to think about, especially when we're talking about fair use in fandom, is not all characters are copyrightable. Because fans are so familiar with this, right? Like characters fit into tropes. You know this because you know what the popular ships are, and you can be like, oh, that's the Harry of that ship, right? Or that's the Sherlock of that ship, right? Like you know how the ships play out. And so that gets complicated too, because not all characters are copyrightable and all that other stuff.
So now I'm gonna have fun and throw something back to the entirety of the panel, since we've been having fun here. So I'm gonna stay on Sherlock Holmes for a moment. It's that idea of Sherlock Holmes as a character, but the representation. So now if we think about Sherlock Holmes, the character, we know from the novels, and we know that not all the stories are in the public domain, it now becomes representation, a la the BBC's Sherlock. Or Elementary,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
I ignore that one.
And even with the Sherlock Holmes stories, there were other authors besides Arthur Conan Doyle because it was, again, pre-copyright, so other authors would just take Sherlock and write their own fan fiction, essentially, and sell it. So.
Kind of going off that, I'm a little bit of a historian when it comes to the genre of sword and sorcery. And at one point in sword and sorcery, there were a lot of people who were writing Conan novels outside of Robert E. Howard and the publisher who actually owned the rights to Robert E. Howard's work. What happened is that you actually saw people, it goes back to the idea of a character or a trope, that you can't copyright a character or trope.
Right.
You would have a Thanir or a Grog the Barbarian. They were all Conan clones, but they can't directly call them Conan.
Right.
You just had to change the name, but it was still the idea of that character.
Well, and that's the phenomenon of, like, you hear people do this, right? They'll file the serial numbers off of their fic, and that's just what they're doing, is they're just changing the character name. Because, as I said, ideas can't be owned, but your expression of it can. And at a certain point, in many cases, the only thing you own is the name. And you're like, well, I can stop you from using my name, but I can't stop you if you change it, because what the character is just so basic a trope that I just can't. That's how you get 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight existing at the same time, right? Like, you can't be like, I own all moody men, right? Like, no, you don't own all moody men. You only
there's
own...
one right here.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not 6 foot
I
four.
was going to point that's what Tim Russ ended up doing with Star Trek Renegades after the accent art decision came down. was change a bunch of the names.
Right.
Well, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing that I'm noticing now, since I helped start a publishing company a couple of years ago, one thing, and it's great that we have an IP lawyer here, because I actually want to ask this directly. One of the issues that we're seeing now with like ebooks on Amazon is that people can take those stories, kind of reprint them, just change character names.
Yeah.
How should people view intellectual property from that kind of place? If we're beginning with, there are authors out there who are stealing other authors' ebooks,
Right.
and then reselling them as their own.
Right.
And in some cases, like, it's the exact same sentence structure, the exact same words used. There's just little changes here in terms of names and locations.
Right.
How should the audience and how should the authors on this panel kind of deal with that?
So the way we look at copyright infringement, which is what we're talking about here, is the way that it's judged. The standard is substantial similarity. So you have to have substantial similarity in something that is copyrightable. And so in your example, if you're just taking the story and you change the name, but you're like literally taking the sentence structure and stuff, I cannot see a court that would be like, that's okay, right? Because that's like identical, right? And even, there's a lot of things that you can't really own a copyright in, like a recipe, because there's only so many ways to say how to make cake, right? Like, there's just only so many ways you can say that. But most courts will let you have what they would call like a thin copyright, protecting you against verbatim copying, right? Like somebody taking that and stealing that. Like, that crosses a line that a lot of courts are uncomfortable with. But if you read a thing on an ebook on Amazon and you're like, that's a good idea, I can do that much better, and then you do that much better, now you're coming to a closer question, right? Like a court might be like, well, you just took an idea which no one can own and you made it better, and so that's not copyright infringement there. And so it's a spectrum, right? Like it's a spectrum, and there's always going to be a point. There's always going to be cases you can make up in your head where you're like, obviously copyright infringing. And there's always going to be cases you can make up in your head that you're like, obviously not. And then the vast majority of your life, or lawyers' lives, are spent like in that period where you're like, I don't know, right? Like, your guess is mine, like flip a coin, right? Because it's hard to figure that stuff out. Does that kind of answer your question on that?
So starting from that point, one of the core ideas that we got in terms of intellectual property, because as authors, as creators, is that, if you're building anything you want to protect, where do we get to that line? And I do want to go to everybody on the panel for this. Where do we get to that differentiation for you between idea and what really becomes intellectual property? And I go to this for one very specific reason. Very frequently at conventions, we will have people come up to our table and go and say, and if you've done this, don't feel bad, but I am admonishing you. Somebody will come up and go, I've got the best idea for a book.
Oh, I'll make you feel bad over that. Don't do that.
I knew I could count on you, Jay. But I wasn't done yet.
But I can't tell you.
Right. I will come up here. I need a contract, though, but I'll give you my idea if you do all the work. So for you guys, where does this concept of idea really migrate into intellectual property? And I will come back to our esteemed panelists in the middle of the table and our attorney out
To tell you if you got it right or wrong, right?
Are we going in any order?
I will start from the far end of the table.
What are we
doing? Somebody nudge him and wake him up. Where do we start? Where's your idea for yourself come from between what's an idea versus what's really protected IP? What are you really concerned about protecting when you get down to it?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, when I was in games, we had a really strict policy about ever even reading anything that somebody sent to us. Just because, and you know, it was the game industry, at least the companies that I worked for, were really paranoid about any kind of copyright infringement whatsoever. So if somebody sent in something that's like, I have a game idea, it was shredded and gone. Because we didn't ever want any possibility of somebody saying, hey, I sent that idea into you guys 2 years ago, now you've made this game, it sold 10 million copies, we want money now. So we would always cut it off, for ideas like that coming to us, we would always cut it off right at the beginning. We just never even took a chance.
I guess from my point of view as a creator, like I said, I started with fan fiction, started writing with Harry Potter fan fiction, but I didn't make any money off of it, so I didn't really consider that a copyright infringement. I'm not making money, I'm not claiming it as my own. With my original works, that's a lot harder because, again, it's the ideas, and I am definitely of the belief that there are no original ideas. And anyone who in the room who thinks, no, I haven't written it, no, it's been done, trust me, somebody has done it. And I know,
it's almost the first rule of writing, almost.
Right.
The story's been told.
Right, it's been told, it's a matter of how you can tell it, and, I personally am of the belief, again, yeah, this has been told, but I'm the only one who can tell it in my way, and I don't think anyone can steal that from me. So it's funny because I do run some writing groups at home, and I will talk to other, burgeoning writers who are like, oh, I want people to read this, but I'm afraid that they might steal it, and I'm just like, don't be, no, they can't steal it. They can't steal what's in your brain, and also that's such an egotistical thing. No, just get over yourself. You're not J.K. Rowling, or Stephen King, or whoever. Name whoever your favorite author is.
But if you are, we get a 10% bonus.
So, I'm personally, that's not something I worry about. I don't worry about people coming up and reading the back of my book and being like, oh, okay, and then later going and writing their own assassin book. Like I said, it's been done, even my ideas come from other places. And again, as a creator, and this is another thing when I talk with writers that they're very polarized about, but when I'm working on a particular type of work, a particular genre or whatever, I read everything in that genre. I will just absorb it because I need more creative energy. I know other writers who will be like, no, I won't read anything because I don't want it to influence me. I'm like, influence me. I need, I want to be the best, And so it's I guess if you want to call that stealing, if I read somebody else's idea and I'm like, I can do that better, I don't think of that as stealing. I think of that as me doing it better.
You're doing market research.
Yes.
All right, Jay.
I come from two directions. As an author, I just want protection for my titles, and I want to make sure that, like, if there is any money to be made for my titles, I'm making it. That's kind of it. From an editor's perspective, this is going to kind of sound counterintuitive to what some writers are told. Don't come up and pitch me. Don't go up to a publisher and pitch them at the table, because
Buy them a drink.
Buy them a drink. Because at the end of the day, what an editor is going to be judging you on is not the storyline idea that you give us, because we've heard so many different storylines pitched to us over time. What matters is the actual work that you put in front of us. I think once you actually create your manuscript and turn it in, I consider it protected on your end as an author, but from my end as an editor, since we're signing you, we have to protect it too. So I think the first thing that John and I think about when we sign a new author in terms of protecting their intellectual property, the first thing that we do is we make sure that they aren't copying ideas wholesale from something else. Like, I just had an author pitch me basically a gender-bent James Bond that did very little to cover the fact that it was James Bond, like, even down to the name. It was like Gene Bond. I said, like, you can't call this person Gene Bond, you can't call them 008, you can't do...
Well, this is a whole other issue, but couldn't that be covered under,
Like a parody.
But it wasn't, we're not saying it wasn't a parody.
Okay.
It wasn't a parody.
Right.
And I had to go through the entire explanation of, like, okay, this if you write this is basically fan fiction, because you're using characters directly from Macaulay and whoever else owns that property. As an editor, one thing that I'm always doing when I'm looking at manuscripts is just going through to make sure that, like, the authors themselves are legally protected from something, because there's a lot of stories now and even in the past that get out, like 50 Shades of Grey, where the line is so blurred that you can't tell. So for me,
It was left hanging by a strap.
yeah, it's like, I hope you got that.
I did.
I tell people how awful this man is so often. I hope you got that. Thank you.
By the way, that's a credit to 88 Lines by 44 Women.
You know, I think editorially our big concern is always just making sure that the author doesn't step in their own way in terms of creating their own world and stepping into things that I come to find that a lot of authors don't even really think about when they're signing a contract, especially when it comes to, like, intellectual property, down to, like, thematic things. Because, like you said, you can't copyright an idea, but there have been characters that I've come across that are so close to other things in terms of name, in terms of how they're presented, that you really have to look out for your authors now in terms of their IP when you sign them. Because there's so much out there right now, and not to belittle lawyers anyway, but so many people are so litigious now that you really do have to mind your P's and Q's when it comes to your IP, even if it's something original that you created. Because there can be anything in there that someone can pick up and just cause you a legal headache.
Right.
Even if you don't go to court, you know, just getting a
cease and desist.
A cease and desist.
Yes.
Even a cease and desist letter causes so many headaches that you have to deal with. So as an editor, you really do have to, like, judge people's intellectual property in terms of not only is this going to sell, but is this also going to make sure? Are we going to make sure that they're not going to end up in court over something?
Well, as a publisher, you would end up
Yeah.
in trouble too.
Same with us.
Yeah.
Publishers have to do, in my opinion, more due diligence than the author does ultimately. But that's also what we sign up for as publishers.
And from my viewpoint, and it's all about execution, and it's not about, again, the idea. It's about how do you deliver, how do you deploy, how do you implement it, how do you ultimately deliver that to your reader, to your customer. If it's a game, how are you deploying that to them? Because it can be more than just that. How am I presenting them? You know, so if it's Jane Bond, who's 00, all right, I'll be nice. It's not the late night panel. It's 009. And so it's Jane Bond coming in. It's how you still implement that, because we're now migrating into the idea of what this panel is about, which is fair use, and the idea of parity, and the idea of use and what do we do with it. So if you're in that gray area, the question is, how much do you as a creator want to go into that gray area? How much are you willing to fight about it? And also, how much is the publisher willing to accept in terms of risk? So it's all a risk management. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, yeah, it is. Yeah.
And if I may add, as a publisher, publishers are extremely risk averse, especially today in the way that the industry is. We have to be extremely risk averse because our margins are so thin that I think, especially for small presses like us, if we had to deal with a real legal challenge, I don't necessarily know that we would survive. And I'm not speaking like from a place of like, oh, we didn't do our due diligence, just financially getting into that sort of situation, it would just be crippling to us. So like the due diligence we have to do is from a purely financial standpoint as well.
Just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to survive.
Right. Exactly.
So let's actually now talk about the title of this panel, which is Fair Use. Oh, what the hell's Fair Use Doctrine. So in a generic term, we have this idea of fair use, which is the idea and even the execution is available to me to use in the public domain. So going back to that conversation with things like Sherlock Holmes, where the characters are in the public use, some of the stories are in the public domain, but not all the stories are in the public domain. So in terms of fair use, if I also look at things such as in the dealer's room over here, I'm looking at artwork representing characters from games, characters from fiction, characters from movies that are new releases. So I'm going to throw this to you guys. How would you feel about this if this was your characters when all of a sudden a fair interpretation of your work shows up in the dealer's room across the way from somebody who's an independent author or an independent artist? Not an author, but an artist. So they're doing a visual representation of your work. How are you going to take that? How are you going to interpret that? And I'll tell a story after we loop all the way back around about how I've seen it happen.
That's a great question because we go to so many cons and we go to like artist alleys and vendor halls and you see so many independent artists doing fan art as it is. That's a really good question.
But they're selling it.
Yeah, and they're selling it. That's the other thing too. I'm one of those people that think that if someone's willing to take the time to draw a portrait of your character, ultimately I would like to be so successful with my work that I don't have to worry about making money, but I'm also one of those weird people that hopes that one day I'll be so successful with my work that other people will make money off of my work. And I think, especially in terms of our community, when it comes to things like art and video, because they're, when you get to things like Axonar and Renegades, I don't know, I think it's so nice just to be recognized that someone put so much time and effort to show their appreciation for your stuff. But at the same time, if someone had one of my characters is named Monway the Panther, he's a black gay thief in an Iron Age world. If someone...
But he steals your heart.
But if someone decided to do a picture of Monway and they were selling it for like $20 a pop on a print, I wouldn't be that mad, honestly. But if they were doing like $500 portraits of Monway and making a killing off of it, yeah, then I'd be pretty pissed. I mean, $500 is a good bit of money. I don't know. I think for me it would just depend on what
So is it a difference in ticker value?
I think it's somewhat of a difference in ticker value. A couple of years, I think last year or a year before Con Carolinas, we had a situation where an artist was stealing other people's work.
Yes.
I think if you ask for permission and someone gives you permission, if someone asked me permission to do pictures of Monway, I'd be fine with it, even if I didn't make money, as long as there's just permission asked.
Which really, it's a matter of scale, though.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, the Paramount was willing to turn a blind eye to every Star Trek fan production for a long, long time, because for a long time, from the time that Enterprise went off the air until the J.J. Abrams movies came out, there was no new Star Trek.
There still was.
And it's true. But Paramount let that go on, turned a blind eye to it because A, nobody was making any money off of it, and B, it was keeping Star Trek going. It was, you still had a fandom going. It wasn't until something was going to potentially cost them money or become competition to them that they drew a line in the sand and said, okay, we can't let this happen anymore. Arguably, Star Wars handled their fan films better because they encouraged it from the beginning but set guidelines right from the start, where they said, 5-minute fan films are cool, we're going to have a contest every year and see who makes the best fan film, and they kind of encouraged it that way. Paramount didn't have any guidelines until Axanar claimed they were going to be the best Star Trek movie ever, and then they're like, okay, we've got this franchise going, we're making a new show, we can't have this. So it is a matter of scale, and Paramount for a long time Paramount wasn't, and I don't know if they still get involved with things like the very first convention I went to, I saw a lot of fanzines that had had fanfic in them that nobody seemed to care that anybody was selling in the dealer's room at that time. But I imagine it's a little different now because Star Trek's such a huge thing.
Well, kind of touching the thing about, this issue being scalable depending on what it is. Do you think that Paramount maybe exercised their IP because of how good Axanar actually looked? Because I was always impressed in terms of Axanar's presentation in terms of its production quality, and I would think that if I was putting out a new movie, where I would be trying to have great production quality as well, I wouldn't want these small little upstart, independent film group to be outdoing me in terms of my production quality.
Story.
That was certainly my initial take on it, but hearing the behind the scenes stuff about it, Star Trek continues. Although it didn't really tread any new ground. It meant to close out the original series, the original 5-year mission. Those episodes, if you haven't seen them, you really should. They did a great job of getting the writing and the lighting, the camera work, everything looks like an original series episode. It looks like a real episode of Star Trek. Paramount let them finish their run even after the Star Trek Axanar thing, because from the beginning, they dealt directly with Paramount and they made themselves a non-profit organization and nobody ever made any money off of it. And Paramount let them finish that out. Whereas Axanar got shut down primarily because all that, $1.3 million is gone, and there's one 2.5-minute scene of the movie that was committed to video. That's all. And I think it was more the money than anything else. Because initially that was my take as well, because it did look great. And Prelude to Axanar is compelling. It's good stuff. But I think it all came down to the money.
I think, and what I would think as far as the Star Trek thing is, why didn't they just hire them? If they were so good and they had this strong fan base that that is the same fan base, why not just hire those people then to make your next movie?
Because Alec Peters is being...
I have seen that quite a few times with parodies.
Because Alec Peters is being an egotistical dickhead about it,
Yeah.
that's why.
It comes down to who's in charge, but I have seen that with parody. Like, for instance, I don't know, is anyone affiliated with Dragon Ball Z Abridged?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, amazing parody. Well, a lot of those voice actors now are in the new Dragon Ball series, voicing minor characters, so they've gotten jobs out of it. And it's clear that the creators are supporting this parody, that they are okay with it. And they don't make money off the parody, but they do, they put a lot of time and work into it. So they have to make money somehow. So what they make money off of is their t-shirts that have, quotes that they made up for their parody. So they kind of have ways around it, but, I think that if you're putting that much work into something, you you should have some way to feed yourself while you're doing it, you know? So I think like to me, that's one of those examples where I think it's worked out really well. And I know it's been bumpy, like it hasn't been completely smooth for them, but like, as I've been following that series, like seeing how, you know, that, I'm gonna mispronounce all the names, but Toei Animation and all that, like how they've, I think, handled it really professionally and have, you know, made sure that they didn't piss off their own fan base, essentially.
Well, and the thing about Axanar and the Star Trek fan films is it's kind of a subset of the Star Trek fan base, and the original Star Trek fan base is smaller than what they're aiming for with the J.J. Abrams movies, which is why those are so vastly different feeling than any Star Trek that came before them. They're slam bang action films. They're not really Star Trek. But one of the other things that Axanar did that compounded their problem is they were giving perks to their investors, like they made Klingon coffee that had the Klingon trefoil symbol on it, and and Star Trek all over everything, and they had no rights whatsoever to be doing that, and that was the kind of thing that just piled on, and that's why they got in trouble with it. And by the end of it, they were so adversarial to Paramount, they were never going to get hired by Paramount.
And for me personally, as far as the question that you had asked, like if I walked in there and saw somebody had made fan art of my character, I would just be honestly really like honored. Be like, wow, you read what I wrote for one, because let me just tell you how hard it is to even get someone to read what you've written, and then you went and made something off of it. So like, yeah, I wouldn't even care. And like I said, if they were good enough, I would just hire them. I'd be like, here, make my next cover. I'll pay you. So.
No, go ahead.
It should also be noted, though, and I kind of want to ask you this question, because the creative landscape is changing so quickly now, where the entire studio system's kind of disappearing now to things like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and any other independent film company that can go out there and actually afford to make a movie. But you also have this proliferation of content throughout the internet that makes fair use and copyright and owning your intellectual property even harder now than it used to be. Especially on like the international level. Like there have been tons of times when we've had our books at Falstaff.
And you're having to file Millennium.
Yep, you're having to file.
Right.
Yeah. That's while we're talking about all this stuff, and you made the point earlier that, especially when it comes to things like public domain's been frozen for such a long time, that's probably not going to last how it is anymore for too much longer. Like things being frozen that way, just because with the proliferation of things like YouTube and Apple TV and stuff like that, everything that we're talking about now may be totally different in 20 years just because of how the medium and the platform itself changed.
Well, when Disney won that extension, which they did in '97, so it's like up now, right? Like we're actually very excited. People are planning parties for like we're gonna have like the first thing enter the public domain, like for the first time since I've been a lawyer, right? I haven't been a lawyer 20 years yet, right? So the whole time I've been a copyright lawyer, I've never had a work enter the public domain. So it's very exciting. And there's a lot of talk like, will Disney just win another extension? And the current going theory is no, because 20 years ago you didn't have an organized internet with the power that like Google and Apple have right now to be like, you know what, we need stuff in the public domain because we are trying to get that stuff, and if we don't have stuff entering it, it's not, like there's that push. Like Google got killed on their Google Books project, like absolutely demolished by the fact that we have such a limited public domain in this country that is like extending to people who died in 1930, right? And it's like, we don't know who their heirs are, we have no one to get in touch with, and now Google's sitting on like 60 million books that they can't do anything with, right? Like, there's no way they're happy about that. And so the theory is
Publishers hold all the time, so you don't know who's going to
you can't find those people,
So who can name the film that Disney first protected and got the extension under several times?
Steamboat Willie, I think it was.
The Rat.
Steamboat Willie.
yeah.
So if you don't remember Steamboat Willie, that was the first Mickey movie under which they have protected Mickey Mouse as a character for what, 90 years?
Yeah, like 90 years, yeah.
90 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's sacred to them, so.
Right. Yes, the rat. Exactly. Well, all right. So now with that, who can name what show went and attacked the rat and Disney lost?
South Park. It's the greatest. It's some of the greatest episodes too in the world because it talks about how like Disney kind of throws around their base of intellectual property against their own artists and their own talent.
Right.
Yeah.
You've been watching South Park and you should be right.
Man, I live in Denver.
I know
Man, I
what
live in
you're
Denver. I do a lot of things I shouldn't.
I know what the Falstaff slush pile looks like.
So can I bring up, like, I guess a question? So what, and maybe this would be good for you, what's, like, your opinion or thoughts on creators who use their copyright to prevent, you know, say, a parody that just, because it reflects negatively on them, like, as a way, basically, to stamp down any negative talk about their creation?
That is
I've seen
literally why fair use, like literally that is why we have fair use, which is why whenever we talk about like the Paramount X&R decision is just a terrible decision for people who are fans of Fanworks. And then it resulted in this whole Paramount being like, well, but if you follow our rules, right, like everything would be cool. And it's like, no, like that's the entire point of fair use, is that I shouldn't have to follow your rules because there are some things I want to make comments on. And one of the most famous fair use cases of, now I'm dating myself because I was like one of the most recent ones, and it's probably like 15 years old now that I'm thinking about it. But it was The Wind Done Gone, which was the Gone with the Wind parody that, I mean, you wouldn't really call it a parody, right? Because parody, like you think about it, like South Park, and this was like a really important commentary on Gone with the Wind, told from the perspective of the slaves in Gone with the Wind, who have been silenced in our telling of this fairy tale antebellum society that we had, right? And they went after it for copyright infringement, and the writer who wrote it won, and one of the things that the court talks about is how viciously Margaret Mitchell's estate was protecting Gone with, and you weren't allowed to talk about slavery as if it was a bad thing. Like that was like literally one of their rules for if you wanted to write like in their Gone with the Wind universe, and you couldn't talk about queer characters. Queerness was not allowed to exist within like the Gone with the Wind universe. And the court was like, this is why we have fair use, because you can't do that stuff. And so you will see fair use used that way, but I mean, you will see writers attack people for parodying them, and it is the thing that makes copyright lawyers die a little bit inside, because that should be, there's like so few clear fair use cases, there's so few, and the ones where you're like, they have hurt my feelings, you're like, boom, they win, right? Like that should be the one clear fair use case that you get, but because it's expensive to go against anyone who has money behind them, right? Law's expensive. You don't get attorney fees automatically in this country if you win, so that's a gamble that you are taking. There are organizations out there. Organization of Transformative Works is not one of them because it's not what our mission are, but there's other ones like Electronic Freedom Foundation who will give you pro bono rep, but you have to know that you have to go and do that stuff. And many of these people are not people who have this support, right? And so you get the cease and desist letter and you like take it off the internet. And in that way, that's damaging, like, outside the bounds of copyright law, right? Like, it's just damaging to our society to not have that discussion going on, because a lot of that stuff is the stuff that we need to hear, right? Like, sometimes you talk about stupid things, and it's, like, easy to get lost in, like, oh, whatever, they can't write their erotica, right? And it's like, no, like, sometimes there's really important things that people are trying to get out there, too, so, yeah.
And sometimes it's just the worst PR move.
Yeah.
To actually go out there and try to stop a parody. Because if you're so serious about your work that you can't stand up to a parody, like, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, I've got a Monway parody coming up.
Let me guess. He's white. He's straight.
He's not a thief.
And he's not a thief. He's a cop.
But he'll still steal your heart.
He'll still steal your heart.
Well, and if he's a cop, then he'll shoot you too.
So we
I've actually gone after
No, this is true.
But parody works.
Yeah.
Like Saturday Night Live is always
Yeah.
parodying it. Family Guy does.
Yeah.
And they also haven't gone after the Orville, which which is
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
inspired
Not
by
here,
Star
yeah,
Trek.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, I didn't mean to
Orville-
imply that Paramount was
No,
running
I,
people
no,
down
I,
this, but
yeah, and I'm not a representative of Paramount, so I don't care.
Right.
But the Axanar wasn't transformative or a parody.
Yeah,
It really
yeah.
was building on a story that was set in their universe that,
Right, right.
that existed.
Yeah.
So.
Although you also, and this is what makes fair use so tricky, you don't have to be a parody though to be protected by fair use. Like it's the thing that people think about all the time, but it's also not.
Critique is also covered by fair
Critique
use.
is covered, commentary is covered, scholarship is covered, right? So I'm like, I'm a professor, so I use clips in class all the time, and I don't really worry so much about it, right? Like there's a lot of things that we are covering.
I'm sorry, can I
So,
ask a quick question?
I was getting ready to say, we've got a couple of minutes left, so please, whatever questions we have not managed to make up an answer.
Would a translation of a novel that isn't available in English count as fair use?
So, generally no, because the reason why I'm saying that is because when you read the copyright statute, translation is actually included as an exclusive right granted to the author. So it will
Right.
say
Let me
that.
ask one question.
Yeah.
Does that not include the country of origin from the original work?
Meaning,
So in other words, if it's
right, so
written-
if it's written in like a country that has, maybe, but we belong to an international convention on copyright that includes like 108 countries, so I don't know what the ones are that are not part of it, but you might have a better chance then. But the international convention, I think, would also consider a translation.
Thinking about specifically.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's frustrating, right? Like, that's just frustrating, right? Because that's like a thing, and I actually think this about a lot of this stuff. Like, when I hear about people are selling Fairnot, right, at like a convention and stuff, I always think, that's a market that you failed to exploit, right? Like, they would buy your thing, like, go and put it out there, right? Like, so, it's like frustrating. And I'm not giving legal advice because that is not my job here, but that is one of like the enumerated rights that are given to authors is rights of translations. So, yeah. Even though translations are themselves artistic, because I know that there are many artistic choices you have to make when you translate things, but yeah.
All right, we have time for one more quick question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm working on something which is turning out to probably be fan fiction, although I'm writing it as something to be sold commercially. And so my question is, you had talked about, okay, well, if you change the names, and I'm not using something that's in the actual things that I'm taking from, that's fine. But then Jay had talked about, oh, editors are very, squeamish
Persnickety.
about taking things that might be questioned or sued about later or something. Like, what
I'm
happens?
squeamish. There are editors out there who aren't squeamish about that at all. I think when it comes to the potential of a submission that you're going to be putting out for possible commercial release, I think it depends if you're doing it with a small publisher. You'll have to work that out with your small publisher. If you have something like an agent, your agent should be able to handle all that for you, especially when it comes to kind of getting back to the question of translations, like foreign subsidiary rights. Usually someone will handle that for you. If you're going through the traditional model of, I got an agent. Yeah. But today,
Come and talk to me because I have advice here. Not legal advice, just life advice. One thing, I just wanted to say this because I felt like I didn't want this panel for us to leave without me saying this, and I just wanted to correct this. Commercialism is not your line for fair use. You can sell things and it's still fair use, and you cannot sell things and it's not fair use, right? Like, that's just one of the factors. So I just wanted to, the only Supreme Court case really on fair use was Two Live Crew selling a rap parody of Pretty Woman, right? And they were selling it, and the court was like, that's cool, right? Like, that doesn't mean it's not fair use. On the other hand, music piracy is people giving stuff away for free, and that is definitely a copyright infringement, right? Like, you can't hide behind the free stuff. So I just kind of wanted to say that because I know that that's like a misconception that a lot of people have, like, as long as I'm not doing it for money. That's awesome, that totally helps, right? But that's not like your drawing line, so.
Could you also tell us where to find those Paramount rules that you talked about?
They're posted on Paramount's website somewhere.
Google them, they're really easy to find.
I'm not, like
Paramount Fan Film Guide. Google Paramount Fan Film Guidelines. You'll find it right
okay,
away.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody saying. Please give our panelists some love here, and behind the bar. Either one.